Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kishore Mahbubani. I'm the Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this talk by the Dutch Finance Minister. His name is Mr. Jeroen Dijsselbloem. I'm sorry if I mispronounced it. I thought Asian names were difficult, but Dutch names can be challenging too. So as some of you may know, I make it a habit of making 3 quick points before I welcome the speaker to come to the podium. My first point will be about Singapore and the Netherlands, second point about Europe and Asia, and third point I'll say a few points about our speaker. Singapore and the Netherlands, the point I was going to make is that we share so many similarities in common. As countries, we have to struggle against the fact that we don't have bountiful natural resources. We do the best that we can with our human resources. And therefore, in the 2013 World Economic Forum Human Capital Index, Singapore and Netherlands were ranked 3rd and 4th for maximizing the long-term potential of its labor force. And both our countries were ranked in the top 10 for the 2013 Global Competitiveness Index. So we share a lot of things in common, Netherlands and Singapore. More importantly, Netherlands is 4th in the UN World Happiness Report. I don't know where Singapore stands, but it says Singapore is number 1 in Asia. Well, so we are, I guess, equally happy. More seriously, on the second point on Europe and Asia, the point I'm going to make is that, one of the things that I'm most proud of in my career in the Singapore Foreign Service is that I was involved in helping the then Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Goh Chok Tong, launch the idea of an Asia-Europe meeting. And the reason why we did that in the mid-1990s was because there was obviously a very strong links across the Atlantic between the United States and Europe, very strong links across the Pacific between the United States and East Asia, but virtually very weak links between Asia and Europe. That was the missing link across the world. And the good news is that since that time, we have come a very long way, and now the EU has, as you know, concluded an FTA with Singapore, which we hope will pave the way for other FTAs in this region, also leading eventually also to an ASEAN-EU FTA. So, and the very fact that we have a finance minister from the Netherlands here to speak about the subject is an indication of how far we have come. And everyone knows that clearly there's a lot of potential in both Asia and Europe, although I did warn the Dutch finance minister that he may get some tough questions about the future of the euro. And you saw in the Straits Times yesterday a debate between Ambassador Tommy Koh and the Straits Times correspondent Jonathan Eyal on what's the future of the euro. But the Dutch finance minister will give you his views, and they'll be quite strong. And my third point is that he can speak very authoritatively about the euro because he's currently the president of the Eurogroup and also the chairman of the board of governors of the European Stability Mechanism. As we were chatting earlier, I discovered he has a master's degree in business economics research from University College Cork in Ireland. After his studies, he joined the Labour Party and rose steadily in the party and became deputy leader in 2008. He's been involved in a wide range of policy issues from agriculture and fisheries to youth care and educational reform. He's been finance minister since November 2012 and also the president of the Eurogroup since January 2013. So I have absolutely no doubt that he'll give us a very stimulating address. And more importantly, I have promised him that we will ask him some difficult questions after that. So please join me in welcoming Jeroen.
Dean, thank you for your warm words of welcome. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us and having the opportunity to speak to you and to answer your questions on where we stand in Europe, the developments in the Eurozone, which have been hectic, but we're now moving into a new phase, and I would like to talk to you about that. Also, for me, it's the first time in Singapore, and it's, as the Dean said, very interesting to see in the way that Singapore, in its international orientation, its trade, international trade focus has very many similarities to a country like the Netherlands, which is basically quite small, but has a long tradition in international trade. So it's very interesting to be here, and thank you for being able to learn from that. To be in the #1 country in terms of the World Bank's doing business indicators, and the second in the World Competitiveness Index, is of course a great pleasure. And also to be in the city with the second largest container port in the world. As a Dutchman with our Dutch Rotterdam harbour, of course you can understand my interest in that. I also took interest of the fact that you are going to move your part of your port to a different area to redevelop that particular area. We've done the same in Rotterdam, so this was again one of the interesting things to see. My compliments to this wonderful school, which you have developed in less than 10 years into a major player in the public policy. And we were discussing earlier the possibilities for Dutch students and professionals to come to your school and to study here. That would also be a very interesting way to exchange experience and knowledge. So Singapore and this school, some of the successes which have been achieved in the recent decades. Successes based on successful cooperation with other parts of the world, of course with the US, as you said, with China, but also with Europe. And this school, for example, benefits from close cooperation and exchange of knowledge with the Harvard Kennedy School, Columbia University, LSE, Sciences PO in Paris, and if I understand correctly, you have students of more than 50 different nationalities, speakers from all over the world. So very honored to be here. But you can also see this interconnectedness on a more macro level. Singapore is by far the EU's largest trading partner in Southeast Asia, and some 8,800 European companies are established in Singapore. Conversely, Singapore is Asia's second largest investor in the EU. And only last autumn we have translated this intensive and good cooperation into a comprehensive free trade agreement, which is currently under discussion in our institutions. Given the intensive cooperation you have with Europe, I can imagine you're interested to know what's going on in the Eurozone. We've become stronger as a result of a crisis. You know the expression, never waste a good crisis. I think we've done exactly that. We've had I don't know whether it was a good crisis, but we've had a tough crisis, and we've used it. We've become stronger. We've demonstrated our ability to weather the storm and taken the opportunity to strengthen our economies. As you know, there are over 500 million consumers in the European Union that are looking for quality goods. EU member countries account for 19% of world imports and exports, and we are a major player on the global trading scheme. And I'm glad the crisis in its essence didn't affect our open market. We retained the capacity to conclude and implement trade agreements, and we also maintained our relatively high degree of equality in standards of living in Europe. Of course, the crisis did hit us hard, yet the euro area has gained strength. In the second quarter of 2013, growth returned and turned positive in almost all the countries, and we expect further acceleration of growth in the years to come. Domestic demands and exports are contributing more strongly to growth, and confidence in Europe, both from the companies as well as the consumers, is reviving. This is also reflected in financial markets. As president of the Eurogroup, I will try and make the point that the euro area remains a very strong trading partner and a good investment opportunity, because we are building on solid foundations. European leaders have taken decisive action to safeguard the euro, and because our recovery and growth strategy will deliver a resilient financial system and make our economies more competitive and our growth sustainable. Now, European leaders have drawn inspiration from the way Asia lived up to the double meaning of the word crisis in the Chinese language. We didn't only see the Asian crisis of the 1990s as a danger, but also recognized it as an opportunity. and Asian countries seized the opportunity to implement a wide range of macroeconomic, financial and corporate sector reforms in recent decades. And as it did so successfully, as shown by the strong recovery soon after the crisis emerged. In Europe, we first responded to the financial crisis by providing assistance to the countries that experienced a loss of market access. And we created the European Support Mechanism, which culminated in the European Stability Mechanism, the ESM. Together with the IMF, it provided financial support to Greece, Portugal, Cyprus and Ireland, and a more specific banking program for Spain. The aim, of course, was to stabilize public finances and get countries back on a sustainable growth path. This would enable these countries to regain full access to financial markets. And I think it's now proving to have been the right approach. Ireland finished this program last month and is now able to rely on market financing again. Spain has successfully concluded its banking program, and other countries are firmly committed to balancing their budgets and reforming their economies, thus bringing them also up to speed again. We went beyond just crisis response. We strengthened our monetary union in 3 areas. First of all, we focused on sound fiscal policies. We implemented fiscal consolidation measures and beefed up our coordination and correction mechanisms. Secondly, we are boosting growth now by reforming our economies. And third, we are establishing a banking union to restore confidence in banks and the euro. Let me explain these 3 different elements in more detail. First, the fiscal policy. Of course, we realize that consolidation measures, commonly known as austerity, may not have a direct positive effect on growth. But it's crucial for sustainable growth in the future and restoring confidence that we clean up the high debts coming from high deficits first. Fiscal consolidation in the euro area is now bearing fruit. The average government deficit is expected to fall below 3% in 2014, and the aggregate debt level will stabilize. The euro area has proved itself considerably more effective in its fiscal policy than, for example, the United States. To encourage and monitor sound fiscal policy, we strengthened the coordination and correction framework considerably. You may have heard of 6-pack and 2-packs, which are further agreements among the countries to tighten and strengthen the framework that we have, the commitment that we have. This is a crucial element of our economic monetary union. The crisis taught us the importance of strong economic and budgetary consolidation. It was a hard lesson, but we learned it well. We are now better equipped to identify and correct macroeconomic imbalances at an early age. We are closely monitoring developments in competitiveness, and the in-depth analysis by the European Commission and peer pressure by ministers have prompted many European countries to put forward and to further implement adjustment measures. Second, our focus is now on restoring and strengthening growth, getting it back on a sustainable track. Sustainable in this context means growth based on a strong yet flexible economic fundamentals, and not so much relying on cheap credit, as was done in the past. The OECD has estimated that European countries can each gain between 5 and 20% extra GDP growth over the next 10 years by implementing structural reforms. These reforms will foster a dynamic business climate, enabling us to remain an interesting business partner for the rest of the world. And all European countries, I stress all European countries, have additional growth potential. From north to south, both in deficit and surplus countries, there is an agenda for structural reform to be fulfilled. We should not be pessimistic here. The European growth model has already shown itself to function very well. I would only like to refer to the World Bank report called Golden Growth, which showed what Europe has done in terms of convergence. The report calls Europe a powerful engine for convergence, enabling countries that lag behind to catch up with more advanced economies. The catching up of Eastern European countries was the most recent example of this. Moreover, structural reforms have accelerated over the recent years, with the crisis acting as a catalyst. Euro area countries have taken important steps to make their economies grow once again. In its Going for Growth report, the OECD presents the achievements of reforms in Europe between 2011 and 2013. Greece, Italy and Spain have reduced regulatory barriers to competition. Ireland and Slovakia have strengthened R&D and innovation incentives. Countries like France, Italy, the Netherlands and Portugal have reduced the insider-outsider problem in their labor markets. And all of us, including my own country, are working hard to deal with the demographic challenges coming from the aging population, for example, by raising the age of retirement or dealing with the rising costs of healthcare. These are just a few examples of our recent efforts, and there is a great potential ahead. So we will continue with measures to improve the functioning of our product and labor markets, measures on taxation, human capital, innovation, to fully grasp the potential that Europe has and to use the momentum that we are now facing. Third key issue at the moment in Europe is creating the banking union, which is being done at unprecedented speed. We want to tackle the too big to fail issue, breaking the loop between banks and sovereigns. But most of all, we want banks to supply credit once again to our companies to realize new growth. And to tackle this, we need to focus on three things: supervision, buffers, capital requirements, and resolution. As for the European banking supervision, we've designed a banking union in which the European Central Bank will be given direct and indirect supervision authority over all European banks. This will enable us to apply the same standards to all banks and to match the international scale on which many of these banks operate. We've also introduced regulations that force banks to build stronger buffers, capital requirements against possible shocks, fully in line with the Basel III standards. They require European banks to keep sufficient capital reserves and liquidity in order to adequately manage banking risks and absorb any losses. And last but not least, we are designing a European resolution mechanism in case a major bank gets into trouble. Now, if that happens, there will be a clear resolution mechanism, including a set of rules to apply bail-in of equity and junior bonds, and if needed, in exceptional cases, senior bondholders as well, in that order. The absolute last resort will consist of a resolution fund, which will be built up gradually over the next 10 years, stocked up by the sector itself, and a public guarantee on the availability of necessary means in that resolution fund. That public guarantee on the resolution fund will be provided by a common backstop, which will be fiscally neutral in the medium term. The exact design of that common backstop is yet to be decided. The European Central Bank will, this year, 2014, complete a comprehensive assessment of the 130 systematically relevant banks which fall under its direct supervision in the course of this year. The banks will undergo a risk assessment, asset quality review, and finally a stress test. Now, this exercise has three main goals: to foster transparency and enhance the quality of information available on the condition of the banks. Secondly, to take corrective action where necessary. And thirdly, to build confidence by assuring all stakeholders that banks are fundamentally sound, once again, and trustworthy. And this will lay a solid basis to allow banks to get funding and to increase lending to private sector business, and therefore strengthen the growth potential throughout Europe. Ladies and gentlemen, to summarize, we haven't merely established a crisis resolution framework we've developed a new fiscal policy. We are boosting sustainable growth through structural reforms, and a lot of work is still to be done there. And we are establishing, as we speak, a banking union. These efforts will together secure the euro as a strong currency and enable us to remain a central pillar of the world economy. They will make our economies more resilient to future shocks and keep our growth on a sustainable track. On that sound basis, I sincerely hope we will be able to step up our cooperation. If we join forces, we can put growth on a more sustainable track on both our continents. Given our strong links and the opportunity to learn from each other, we should see each other not so much as competitors but as partners. We can benefit from one another's growth and learn from best practices. Together we can produce and consume more and better products. Together we can and should accelerate world growth. Many trade agreements that are currently under negotiation or have already been concluded between our two regions will create even more opportunities on both sides. They will open up new markets, both for goods and services, increase investment opportunities, and make trade cheaper and faster, and make the policy environment more predictable. Ladies and gentlemen, looking back over the recent years, I believe one of the main lessons we have learned is that there is never time for complacency. Like Asia in the 90s, Europe was hit hard and had to take painful measures. But also, like Asia, Europe has taken the opportunity to make itself stronger and will continue to do so. I'm convinced that we can continue and extend the recent positive sentiment towards the euro area and remain an important and stable and reliable partner. And I'm convinced that investments and opportunities for young people in jobs and education are viable. This school and its students are an inspiring example of what may be achieved by joining forces. And we will look for more opportunities and send some Dutch students over. Keep up the good work. And you know, I'm looking forward to hear your views and to answer your questions. So thank you very much.
So we will now start the process of asking you difficult questions.
Right.
I'll ask the first one before I turn to my friend David Marsh to ask you the second difficult question. You know, you mentioned about what you're trying to do to ensure that crisis doesn't happen again. But one of the best ways of making sure a crisis doesn't happen again is to sort of ask ourselves, what mistakes did we make that led to this crisis in the first place? I mean, one obvious one, if I can suggest it, is that obviously when the new members of the Eurogroup were admitted, some were admitted even though they technically didn't qualify. For example, Greece, right? I mean, they were sort of, everything was fudged to allow them to enter when everyone knew they didn't qualify. So that was an example of a mistake. But what were the other mistakes you think that were made that led to this crisis becoming as big as it was?
Right. I think in the example of Greece, an important lesson has been learned that we have to be able to trust one another's statistics. And a lot of, well...
That's a big...
That's quite elementary. And a lot of work has been done there to make sure that we can trust the statistics. Basically, what we have improved over the course of the crisis is how we work together. You cannot have a monetary union without having a stronger policy coordination, without having true commitment, also on a political level, commitment to working together. To give you one example, at the end of last year, we had for the first time in the Eurogroup all the draft budgets on the table. So this is the new procedures coming from the 2-pack and the 6-pack.
You all exchange your draft budgets?
All the draft budgets, before they're pushed through Parliament, have to be sent to Brussels. The European Commission then gives off an assessment, and we discuss them in the Eurogroup. The easy way out would have been, well, I'll say you're fine, and you'll say I'm fine. I'm okay, you're okay.
Yeah.
And
you scratch my back, I scratch your back.
Exactly. And I was very, very happy that that didn't happen. And we had a very firm and critical discussion about each other's budgets, but even more so about what is needed in terms of further reforms in different countries. And the outcome of that was that a number of countries put forward further proposals for reforms in their budget or in their labor markets or in their pension system. So the outcome was we accept the commitment that we have, we don't walk away from that. Coming out of the crisis, we still realize that a lot of work has to be done, and we do. And as long as we keep confronting each other that way and translating that into action, further reforms and political action, I think this monetary union will become stronger.
Just a quick follow-up question. I mean, again, talking of mistakes, I mean, it's sort of well known now that the reason why the European Union couldn't, the Eurozone couldn't implement the 3% budget requirement because France and Germany, the two biggest countries, were the first to break that limit, and therefore they opened the doors for others. Are you now certain that the biggest countries will preserve that limit?
In the end, it's always the political will that determines whether we stick to our agreements. But I think we've learned a very, very expensive lesson. And the expensive lesson is that if you don't stick to a coordinated fiscal and economic policy throughout the Eurozone, you will take great risks, and the risks will hit one another. There is no thinking, oh, well, they're making a mess of their budget and they're getting their macroeconomics all wrong, but it won't affect me. So that sense, and that sense of urgency that has come out of that, I think we've used. And we need to strengthen it further. But we've made a lot of progress, I think.
Okay, David, you want to ask a question? David, then if I throw the floor open, you can identify, you can go to the mic if you don't mind, David. Identify yourself for the audience, and then the floor is open after that.
Yes, thank you, Kishore. Thank you, Minister. My name is David Marsh from a think tank called OMPFIF, based in London, and it's a great pleasure to hear you. And I think you're right, actually, to put emphasis on commonality between Europe and Asia. But I've got a couple of questions, both about the future. You've spoken a lot about the need for political coordination, and one remembers that the Dutch in particular, more than 20 years ago, did place a very great requirement on some kind of political union. Do you think we'll ever get to the stage in Europe where we've got a sufficiently federal Europe for the European Central Bank to become a proper central bank that could underwrite mutualized euro borrowing, which would be very helpful in times of crisis? And the second question does relate to Greece. Kishore brought it up. Greece is a special situation, clearly, and we know that they had a very large debt restructuring already in 2012. The finance ministers promised that there would be an attempt to get the debt level of Greece, which is something like 170% of GDP, the government debt level down to more like 120%, and that this would happen sometime after the German elections, which have now happened. And we've got a bit of a problem here, because the Greeks would like to have a rescheduling for obvious reasons, and the IMF is pushing for this. There's not a huge amount of enthusiasm from the European finance ministers, particularly since a lot of this debt is owed to official creditors. And there's the unpleasant question of the European parliamentary elections taking place in May, which are quite an interesting bellwether of political opinion. So how do we get out of that dilemma regarding Greece?
Right.
Thank you. Are the questions hard enough for you?
Well, thank you very much, David. First of all, on the political union, I think it's sensible to say that the political union is a very gradual process. And anyone who feels that there has to be a grand design and we have to take a giant step to that grand design is simply overlooking the debate also in the Euro countries on where should Europe go and how the electorate is viewing that. So I think, personally, I don't believe that we have to centralize all our policies in order to become a strong and sustainable European monetary union. I don't believe that that's true. I do believe that we need strong coordination mechanisms, and yes, we need a effective ECB. Regarding ECB, it depends on what you expect from monetary policy, but it is my opinion that the monetary policy by the ECB is very adequate, and that the ECB has the authority and the instruments to do its job. Now, some have a different view on what monetary policy could bring and should bring, but I come from a Dutch tradition in which we give a limited scope of what monetary policy should do. I'd just like to warn on one issue. It is always interesting to take sort of the easier route out of the crisis, and one of the easier routes would be to have a very large monetary easing policy. Whether that's sensible or not, I'll leave in your midst. But my point is that shouldn't take our attention away from the real issues that we have to deal with, which has to do with structural reforms within our countries. In some countries, in almost all the countries, that has to do with retirement age and pension systems. In a lot of countries, it has to do with labor market. They should be more flexible and more opened. In a number of countries, there are big issues in the housing sectors and real estate, which have to be addressed. In many countries, the educational system needs a boost. These are the real structural issues that Europe has to deal with, which we are dealing with now. And the pressure will have to be kept on. Even coming out of the crisis, there should be that sense of urgency on those issues. And let's not look too much at the ECB and ask the ECB to solve our problems. Our problems are of a real economic, macroeconomic nature, and we should deal with them. The second question was about Greece and its debt level. As you know, it was in December 2012 when we finalized the last and current program for Greece. It runs until the end of this year. So I foresee that in the next couple of months we will deal with some of the smaller issues in the current program. The present review is being concluded, the fourth review, and we will deal with the outcome of that in January, February. The big issue is about the future. How to deal with the debt sustainability in the future for Greece. And we've agreed and committed ourselves to reaching an agreement on that in the second half of this year. That's what we agreed in December 2012. In the second half of this year, we will come back to the future Greek program. Will there be a new program? What will be its character? And how will we deal with debt sustainability? There are many ways to deal with that. There won't be a great write-off, but there has to be a solution. There are many different solutions there, and we will take a decision in the second half of this year. One thing is for sure, in the Eurogroup, we have committed ourselves, if Greece commits itself to all the action that needs to be taken in Greece, but also, for Greece, there are no easy ways out. There are some really serious reforms that have to take place. If that's possible, then the Eurozone is fully committed to support Greece out of the crisis and out of its debt situation.
Great. Okay, please come, Professor Wu Ming Kang from our school. Yes.
Good evening. My name is Wu Ming Kang. I'm a faculty member of Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Minister, actually, in your speech, you make a very interesting point that Asia and Europe should learn from each other the best practices. So I just wondering if you have any specific best practices in mind that Singapore can learn from Netherlands or Netherlands can learn from Singapore. Thank you.
Well, I think, should I answer straight away?
Yeah.
A very interesting example is education. Education system in the Netherlands has become, since the 60s, very individualized, not so much on hard skills, but much on personal development, etc. And in the Netherlands, we are very interested in your educational system and the high standards of quality that you have in terms of skill and knowledge. Yet I understand that in your country there is also an interest in developing more maybe the soft side of education. So that's actually an interesting example of where we want to raise our standards on the tough side of education, skills, knowledge. We want to be among the top 5 countries coming out of the PISA research done by the OECD, and we want to learn how you perform so well. And maybe you can learn also from the Dutch educational system, which is very good in more personal development, individual development, the softer side, if you want. That could be an example.
Good. Zeger, I come to you.
Zeger van der Wal, also a faculty member at the school and from the Netherlands. So, goedemiddag.
Don't ask the question in Dutch.
I won't. Don't worry. It's good to hear when you sort of. I look at the Netherlands as an outsider more and more, after having been here for about 2 years, and it's good to hear an optimistic story. And I get the feeling also when I talk to friends and former colleagues that things are really improving in the Netherlands. I have a question, a follow-up question to my colleague. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, I think has learned a lot from the early days of the EU in how it shaped its structures. And I think nowadays, when I talk to students and practitioners, there was a time a few years ago when ASEAN wanted to adopt a common currency. I think that idea has sort of faded away, correct me if I'm wrong, due to all the problems in the Eurozone. But I think there's still a lot of intentions to strengthen economic cooperation. Do you have any perhaps tips or suggestions for ASEAN in further strengthening economic integration from which they can learn from the EU? Given that there are also huge differences within ASEAN between countries such as Myanmar and Cambodia and Singapore, which are maybe even larger than differences between the Netherlands and Greece.
Right. If I understand correctly, ASEAN has sort of 3 pillars, economic, political, and more cultural. Coming from the European experience, I think it's very sensible to try and strengthen the economic cooperation first. Because if there is a strong incentive and reward coming from that economic cooperation, it then becomes much more easy to work further and cooperate further in political and cultural fields. Having said that, I think that I quoted the World Bank report, Golden Growth, which proves also statistically what the European Union, before the crisis, did in terms of conversions. And I think ASEAN could do the same, also by investing in each other's countries. Some of the countries are already at a higher level of wealth and are able to invest in other countries that need to catch up, in a sense. That kind of conversions could also take place in the Asian region. My advice would be, but I'm absolutely sure that you already know this, before going into a monetary union, make sure that you've done a lot of that coordination and conversion. This is crucial. But it's interesting, you know, if you look back on the history of the European Union, what conversion took place in, for example, countries like Spain and Portugal, in economic sense, after they entered the European Union. It's been quite dramatic. And that shows that the single market has been a very successful concept, and I hope it can do the same in the Asian region.
Great. You have a question? Yeah, please. Yes, please. And identify yourself, if you don't mind. Okay. Then I'll come to you.
My name is Tan Keng Soon. I'm from the Tan Ean Kiam Foundation. I have a question for His Excellency, Mr. Dijsselbloem, regarding the speech made by your king at his coronation recently. According to an article I read from the Daily Mail, your king was saying to the effect that the traditional welfare state in Europe is coming to an end, and now you must have a new participation society. So, but when it said that, my interpretation is that he's calling for more cuts in spending, and I think that once people are used to free stuff, it's very hard to take it away. What's the chances of success and still for you to win elections? Thank you.
I see the questions are getting more and more interesting.
Yeah.
Now you mustn't contradict your king in public, by the way.
The last question is, of course, the key question: how do you win the next election? But I'll try and go through it. The remark by the king was actually not made at the time of his inauguration, but it was made at the annual King's Speech, which is the opening of the parliamentary year, much as it is known in the UK,
yes,
where the Queen opens the parliamentary year by a speech. This speech reflects very much the government's policy. It's written by the government. So that's, there can be no misunderstanding that whatever the king has said, I fully agree, and I hope it will be likewise. I don't know. What he said was, he made the point, on behalf of the government, he made the point that we have to change our traditional welfare states to what's called more a participation society, if you will. And it's actually interesting to talk about that in Asia, because in the Netherlands and in Western Europe, as you know, we have very extended welfare states. And one of the downsides of this welfare state is that a lot of responsibility has been taken away from people in their own normal social connections and has gone to government. For example, in taking care of the elderly in our society, we simply expect the government to provide for the elderly in terms of income, housing, healthcare, etc. And the responsibility of the family has been diminished. And so one of the key points when you talk about participation society is that we shouldn't expect everything from the government in terms of welfare. And we have to strengthen, once again, the social connections and the social responsibility, for example, within the families. An interesting point, because I think we can learn from Asia, in which that tradition, that culture is much stronger, better preserved, and a lot was lost in the European societies. That's my personal opinion. So we want to go back to that kind of participation. It's not just let the government solve it, you have to do it yourself. Does it also have an impact on our policies and our budgets? Yes, but it's inevitable. The amounts of money that we in the Netherlands spend on the care for the elderly has been exploding over the last couple of years, growing 7% per year, every year, in times where we didn't have any economic growth. So our wealth was at zero or even negative, and at the same time our expenditure, this kind of healthcare, was going up, up, up. So it's not sustainable. So here we join a vision on society. We need more connecting between people, responsibility within the society and not just at the government level. And that theme coincides with another important theme. We need sustainable public finances. So there is a connection between the cuts. How will we win the elections? By talking about the reason why we do it. And both reasons, both the vision on there should be more responsibility socially within society on a horizontal level, rather than just the vertical responsibility. And the other issue, we need sustainable finances in order to keep our welfare state alive. Both of these issues have to be talked about. And I'm convinced that if we talk to our electorate, our voters on this, that they will recognize it. There is quite a big support in our society on this issue of not relying on government for everything always. So that's what it's about. That's what the king spoke about, and of course I agree.
Please, yeah. That's a secret.
That's a secret.
Your Excellency, my name is Yvonne. I'm a PhD student at the school. My question is about the fact that tax rates in European countries remain generally high, and both individuals and companies have found ways to minimize their tax obligations, and this has deprived governments of revenue. So, in your view, what do you think can be done to address this problem? Thank you very much.
Right, I didn't understand.
No, about taxes, right?
Yeah. So the fact that
tax avoidance.
Yeah, the fact that individuals and companies have found
your tax rates are very high, and companies and individuals are finding ways of getting around it and not paying the high rate of taxes.
It's a very important issue. First of all, I'd like to say that yes, tax rates are relatively high in Europe, but that also has to do with the high standard of living and the high standard of the welfare state. But we have to modernize the welfare state in order to be able to afford it in the future, and also to keep the tax rates down. And I think and I hope that once we pick up growth over the next coming years, there will also be some fiscal space for lowering tax rates. But this is wishful thinking, maybe. The second point is that in order to deal with this dilemma, high standard of living, high welfare state, but it costs a lot of money, it will be very sensible to fight tax evasion. And I'm very pleased that over the last year in Europe, but also internationally, the cooperation between countries on dealing with tax evasion is picking up very much. We are exchanging information, we are cooperating in fighting all kinds of tax evasion. And I think we're only at the beginning of that process. I think it's very, very important. Also for the reason that if you want people to pay taxes, and obviously we want people to pay taxes, they have to have the feeling that it's done in a correct, justifiable way, that everyone pays. If I pay taxes, I like to know that you'll pay also, and that I'm not the silly bugger. So that has to be, but so it's very crucial for a sense of social justice, that everyone pays, and also the big companies and the multinationals have to pay taxes there where they do their business. So this is a very big theme. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next question. Yes, please. Can you come to the microphone, please? Yeah. Again, identify yourself.
Thank you, Mr. President, for your insightful presentation. My name is Wang Xinbin from Everbread Business Consultancy. I have two questions. The first question is, what's your view on the sustainable growth must be achieved or only can be achieved together with on the liberal democratic system?
I'm not
that means
sure I
because
understood.
look at what's happening in Asia, look at the situation in China, Thailand, or Cambodia. The sustainable economic growth, there's one popular school of thought that only can be achieved based on liberal democratic social system or political system. This is the first question. The second question is, what's your opinion or your advice for ASEAN, this region, ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Countries, to sustain the rivalry among the superpowers? Because relatively the significance of ASEAN to the world is not much so significant compared to Eurogroup. Even though there's similar situation like China, Russia, or US, they're fighting for something for Europe, or Europe is becoming stronger and stronger. But it's obviously ASEAN is not in the similar situation. Thank you. I would like to hear your views and opinions about whether ASEAN can sustain the rivalry among superpowers. Thank you.
Well, you're getting some difficult geopolitical questions.
Right. Geopolitics, yeah.
The first one is also a very challenging one.
The first one was
simple
about
question is,
the relation
can China sustain its growth?
Right. Actually, this answer may surprise you, but I'm not sure. That actually, I know for a fact that you don't need to have a liberal democracy to have economic growth, because there are simply examples throughout the world where there has been an enormous raise in the level of wealth due to economic growth in countries where there was no liberal democracy. Do I prefer liberal democracies? Yes, I do, for many reasons, and most of all for the aspect of individual freedom and the right of choice for the individual in all the aspects of his life. But that's a political statement. Your question was, can you have growth and sustainable growth in other political systems? I think the answer is yes. I think that there are different ways of taking the right decisions, creating the right business climate, and allowing for the right investments to take place. But I still prefer the liberal democratic system. The second one was more geopolitical, about Asian rivalry in the context of the large world blocks, US, China, Europe. I think that, and this comes from a Dutch perspective, if you are a small country that thrives on international trade, you do well to support international cooperation you do well to maintain as good as possible relationships with all your neighbors. And my advice would be not to try and compete in terms of military power, etc., with the big countries. They will be very busy with one another, and at the same time, Southeast Asia can become more and more wealthy while these guys are fussing over geopolitics. That would be my advice. I think the historic experience in Europe is that on the basis of the economic cooperation which started after the Second World War, the whole concept and idea of we are always at war with one another somehow has disappeared. And I would hope that that idea, I spoke to your dean about this, that's where my inspiration now comes from remarks he actually made, that process that took place in Europe could also take place internationally. If we focus much more on what we have in common, in the convergence of our economic system and economic cooperation, the whole concept of when's the next war going to be between whom will disappear and become less and less obsolete.
Thank you. Next question. Yes, please. Again, identify yourself, please.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Takeo Sumino. I'm from a Japanese financial institution called Nomura. And I was very impressed to hear their difficulties or the challenges you went through actually made the process and probably their unification in the euro very strong. Having said that, I'd like to know, do you foresee any more unknown challenges going forward?
Because if they're unknown.
Yeah, unknown.
No, but Rumsfeld says there are known unknowns and unknown unknowns.
Because a lot of people talk about the geopolitics. I think a lot of people think about the risk in Middle East or other regions that is not really controllable by yourself. But because of the leverage and regulations that a lot of people have put in place, I think what actually caused the 2008 financial crisis seems to be pretty much reviewed and pretty much being challenged. And I think it's pretty much now going into under control. Yeah. But then the risk is, what is the next thing that you don't know is likely to create another potential risk of euro shouldn't exist? So what do you think it could be?
What we now do in the Eurozone and in European Union is that we assess all the countries on their macroeconomic imbalances. This is a continuing process. So every year we ask ourselves the question, what could be the next crisis in economic terms, or in financial terms, or in social terms even, in country X, Y, or Z. And once these risks have been identified, it could be the housing market, the pension system, the healthcare system, it could be the business climate in general, it could be the financial sector. Once these risks are identified, immediately they become part of the program, which is the adjustment program that all the countries have to commit to. And every year in an annual cycle, which has only been introduced as an outcome of the crisis, in this annual cycle we will ask the countries what they are doing to deal with their macroeconomic imbalances. And they will be confronted in the meeting of the Eurogroup. The issues will be put on the agenda and the countries will be confronted to deal with those issues. So that's a very interesting mechanism in which we don't wait for the next crisis, where's it going to come from? From now on, we will continuously, annually assess the situation in different countries and translate it to reforms that are needed. So I think that's great, it's a great improvement to where we come from.
If I just follow up on that question in terms of the next crisis, I mean, as you know that when Bernanke announced that there might be a tapering, the markets got very upset for a while. Now they have calmed down a bit. But how responsible do you think the United States is in terms of managing its monetary and fiscal policies? And do you think the next crisis will come from there?
I'm not going to predict. I don't have a glass ball which will tell me what's going to happen.
You can talk about hypothetically. One hypothesis.
What I do see is that the US is very much aware that the process of tapering, getting out of the quantitative easing,
It's not easy.
Is not easy and carries risks, not just for the US, but mainly even outside the US, for example, in some of the emerging economies, where a lot of the easy money has gone to. So they will have to do it very responsibly, and it is my impression that they do understand this and that they will do it responsibly, at a responsible pace. The fiscal side is complex, it's much more political in a sense, but it seems that the Republicans and the Democrats on Capitol Hill have reached an agreement. I don't know how long this one's going to last.
It's a temporary agreement.
I know, but it seems to be a little more stable than the previous one, which was very temporary.
3 months.
So I hope that every agreement that they reach will be a more long-term agreement. But there is a big issue there, and that's why, you know, has been a lot of criticism also coming from the US to the Eurozone. You're not dealing with your problems, deal with it. This is one that they have to deal with, you know, so if I could just say that once, deal with it.
But that leads to a very puzzling situation in the world, because on the one hand, if you look at it objectively, there are lots of long-term uncertainties about how the United States is going to manage these political processes, because there's an incredible polarization in Washington, D.C. And yet, when a crisis happens, everybody runs to the US dollar. Why is that so? Why aren't they running to the euro?
They're actually also running to the euro. As you know, the euro is highly valued at the moment. Some would say even too high, but it's the rates for the euro are very high. So it's a trustworthy and strong currency. I think the situation in the US is not that different from other parts of the world. One of the key issues for the longer-term economic outlook for every country is political stability. And, you know, Europe is a complex place. European Union is now 28 countries, 28 different political systems with elections at different times, which is also a complication. There's always an election coming up somewhere. So this is all very complex. And the electorate in the different countries is more mobile now than it was 10 or 20 years ago. People change their minds quicker. So you see governments coming and going. And yet, during the course of the crisis, we've taken some tough decisions and have reached an agreement on further cooperation, which is not particularly popular. You know, I think the same challenge goes for the US. If you want to deal with the big issues, you need to work together politically. And that's basically also, I'm not saying it's going to be easy. I see the Tea Party and other developments in the US politics. But Democrats and Republicans will have to work together in order to deal with the long-term budgetary issues.
Okay, please, High Commissioner, come. Do you mind coming to the microphone?
How do you scrutinize the trade agreements that the existing ones and the new ones that will come into formulation in future, especially the TPP, with taking into consideration that you have all these countries with their own elections, their own trade agreements? How does that affect the Eurozone, the Euro management?
Right. I'm going to be quite frank. This is not a great field of expertise. I don't know too much about the details of earlier trade agreements and the new ones, so I'm not sure that I can answer your question. What my policy aim would be is to expand the number of trade agreements that we have. A lot of work's being done right now in different regions. Europe wants to have a number of new trade agreements, and once we have a number of trade agreements also in this region, we could then work on an ASEAN EU trade agreement. In general terms, that will be my ambition. In more detail, I'm not sure that I can answer your questions, so you'll have to bear with me.
Thank you.
Okay. Can you come to the mic too? Can you put the mic back?
David has been keeping his really critical question for this.
This is a more personal question, so this can be totally just between us, basically, in these four walls.
Of course.
You've been at the Eurogroup only a relatively short space of time. What are the things you've most enjoyed about it, and what are the least good things about the Eurogroup? And then secondly, if you were to give a totally objective assessment of your work compared with your esteemed predecessor, Mr. Juncker, totally objective, nothing to do with you, what would you say would be the good things that you've done in comparison with your predecessor, and what things have you done worse than he has?
Right. I knew that this was a real critical question.
It gives you an opportunity to shine.
Yeah.
You can say you're just brilliant, that's all.
I think, seriously, we have to be very grateful for the fact that a very experienced European politician, and Jean-Claude Juncker, led the Eurogroup through the highest or deepest moments of the crisis. And I can just
He's the former Prime
former
Prime Minister of Luxembourg, right?
The now former Prime Minister of Luxembourg, yeah. He's now the opposition leader, which apparently he enjoys. But seriously, I think he's done a very, very good job. He is and was a very experienced man who has led the Eurozone through the most difficult period. When I entered the Eurogroup, there was at the time a strong debate about North against the South. That had nothing to do with Jean-Claude Juncker, but had to do with the situation, the crisis, and the support that had to go to a number of countries in the South, etc. And every issue on our agenda seemed to be dominated by the conflict between the North and the South in the Eurozone. I've made it my point over the last year to break through that conflict. I don't believe in it. I don't believe it comes from a right analysis of our problems, and it's not very productive or helpful. For example, some of the structural reforms that have to be performed in the housing market are the same in the Netherlands as they are maybe in Spain. Some of the structural reforms that have to take place in the labor market are comparable between the Netherlands and France and Italy, or also Spain. So all of these issues, the issue of costs of health care, go right through Europe. All of the real structural issues that we need to focus on now are not northern or southern, but go right through Europe. My point was very much proven in the discussion we had on the banking union. The banking union was not a discussion of northern against southern countries. For example, I, as a Dutch minister, worked very closely together with the Spanish minister on getting the resolution mechanism right and the bail-in and the bail-out rules. There were some countries who wanted all the banks in the mechanism right from the start, some countries who wanted the small banks out of the banking union. But these countries were not particularly north against south, but once again were right through Europe. So if you want to ask me what am I happy about, it's that we broke through that unproductive and not true contradiction north-south.
Okay. The last question will be from the lady over here. I'm sorry, the time's up, so please make it as difficult as you can.
No, it's not going to be difficult. Excellency, thank you very much. Can
you identify yourself? Sorry for this.
My name is Marion Zipfel, and I'm a French freelance journalist in Singapore. It's been quite a few months since that we've seen European officials coming to Singapore or coming over Asia. Thank you for your positive presentation about how the EU has gone out of the crisis and how it makes stronger. Is that a communication tool to Asian leaders? Do you need to reassure your counterparts? Is it because you felt some criticism or some skepticism after the crisis and that you need to come back and say, yes, we are strong, we can do this? Is that communication? Are you using also Singapore as a platform to talk to other Asian leaders and try to bring back their skepticism? Thank you.
Thank you. The actual reason for my visit is that I got a lot of invitations. And I think the reason for that is not because people want to see me particularly, but they want to know what's going on in the Eurozone. And they want to know, what are you doing? So I think it's, the timing seems to be right. There is a great interest. I had some very interesting talks last night and earlier today with the counterparts, with people from the financial sector, with my colleague, the Singapore's Minister of Finance, with investors who are all very, very interested in what's going on in Europe. Is Europe truly coming out of the crisis? What are you doing to strengthen your economic recovery? So to me, it's an interesting lesson. First of all, I'm very glad to be able to explain what we're doing and where we are now, so you don't have to be dependent on the Financial Times only. This is a joke.
Or the Economist.
Oh, the Economist. It's good to hear it directly from people who are directly involved. And once again, I'm truly very interested in what goes on in Asia, how Asia has dealt with the economic crisis that has been here before. And Singapore is, of course, a very inspiring place. I mean, just driving through the town, it's vibrant in every way. There's a lot going on. And I'd like to see the Netherlands even more a Singapore by the North Sea.
I must say that that's an excellent note on which to end, you know. He's obviously made us in Singapore feel very good. The Netherlands want to emulate Singapore. But more seriously, I think you've done a great job. Thank you very much.